Hello everyone, welcome to Byjus Exam Prep IAS. Today we are here with the analysis of the Hindu newspaper for 8th of March 2024. Now to begin with, let's have a look at all the articles that we have today, all the important articles that we have to look at. So as you see here, there are these articles that we are going to cover in today's lecture. Now one thing to note here, if you look at this, there are three articles that we have taken from the editorial page, and all these three articles have been discussing very similar issues, and these are issues related to women participation in employment and various sectors where they have been facing problems in one way or the other. So that's why these three articles will try to look at a cumulative analysis of these three articles. Apart from that, there is one very important article, the first article that we are going to discuss, a bold step towards cervical cancer free future. So we'll understand what exactly the government of India is doing with regards to cervical cancer, and then various aspects of cervical cancer. We'll try to understand this disease as well. Then after that, there is another article, bridging the gap in health research. So there is a report by World Economic Forum, and this particular article or editorial is based on that. So there are five editorials in total that we are going to discuss in today's lecture. And then apart from that, one very important development yesterday has been with regards to the Supreme Court and how there has been a split in Sena. So we'll discuss that. And then there is an article on human-wildlife conflict. Kerala comes up with long short-term measures to prevent man-animal conflict. So these are the articles that we are going to cover in detail. And then apart from that, there are these two articles that we are going to cover from prelims perspective. So without wasting any time, let's begin with our discussion on today's topics. Now the first topic that we have right here is this: a bold step towards a cervical cancer free future. And this is an editorial that has been published on page number 14 of today's The Hindu newspaper. Now today, given that today is Women's Day, and that's why we see that there are a lot of women-centric issues that have been covered in today's newspaper. And that's why there are all these five, as I told you, that there are a total of 5 such editorials which have a very important context, especially given your mains examination. So from the perspective of GS paper 1, social issues, GS paper 2, social justice, and then there are certain issues, there is one context in GS paper 3 from science and technology perspective, because we are talking about a disease here. Now what we are talking of is cervical cancer. Now cervical cancer, if I give you some data, some context about cervical cancer, this article basically has been talking about the budget 2024-25, where there has been an update about vaccination program with regards to HPV. Now how exactly this HPV vaccination is important, we need to understand that. So for the context, understand some data with regards to cervical cancer, because the whole crux of this article is around cervical cancer. Cervical cancer right now is the 4th most common cancer in women globally, and approximately more than 6.5 lakh new cases have been registered only in 2024. So more than 6.6 lakh cases to be exact. So cases just in 2022 as per WHO data, and it has led to almost 3.5 lakh deaths in 2022 alone. So that's why we need to understand the severity of the situation where these data have been published by WHO. Now when it comes to cervical cancer, what we have understood is that the highest rates of cervical cancer incidence are normally associated with low and middle income countries, and that is why it reflects a major problem that we have seen with the lack of access to vaccination, lack of understanding of the disease, lack of cervical cancer screening, etc., and the treatment services which are not really available in many of these countries. Even when we look at the social and the economic determinants, we do understand that this is also one issue, one area of concern when it especially comes to the low and middle income countries. So in that context, when we look at how exactly cervical cancer has to be understood, first try to understand what do we mean by cervical cancer. Cervical cancer is something which is caused by a persistent infection with the HPV virus. Now, women, especially living with HIV, have been seen to be prone to more than 6 times they have been likely to develop the cervical cancer as compared to women who live without HIV. Similarly, at the same time, when we look at the vaccination, the treatment, and the screening, this is where we see that these are very effective strategies with regards to cervical cancer, and they are also very cost effective methods in looking towards or solving these issues. At the same time, early screening and early detection is a very important factor when it comes to cervical cancer. So overall, what we understand is that countries around the world have been working to understand how to take care of these issues, and they have been looking towards various aspects of uh, strategies that they can adopt to eliminate cervical cancer cases in these countries. And overall, there are targets that WHO has kept so that by 2030 we can eradicate these cases of cervical cancer all across the world. So that's why we need to understand all these aspects of cervical cancer. Overall, when it comes to uh, cervical cancer basically is a type of cancer that happens or occurs in the cells of the cervix, which basically is the lower part of the uterus that connects to the vagina in females. Now, overall, when it comes to cervical cancer, we understand that most importantly, it is the HPV virus that leads to the cervical cancer cases. Now, this infection, when it comes to the cervical cancer infection, we understand that HPV is something which is very commonly infection which is sexually transmitted and which also affects the skin, the genital areas, and also the throat. And almost all sexually active people in one way or the other probably can be infected at some point of the other with HPV. But usually these HPV infections do not have any symptoms. In most of the cases, the immune system is able to clear the HPV from the body. Now, persistent infection with very high risk of HPV, this is something that can cause abnormal cells to develop, and this is something that can start to grow into cancer. So that's why just remember that in most of the cases of HPV, the HPV infection may happen in people who are sexually active, but that will be taken care of by the human immune system in most of the cases. But in certain cases where this is not where the immune system is not able to take care of it, especially in cases of persistent HPV infections, this is something that can lead to you can say growth of cancer cells, and this is something that can become cancerous. So overall, when it comes to the persistent HPV infection of the cervix, this is something, if it is left untreated, it can cause 95% of the cervical cancer cases. Typically, it can take up to 15 to 20 years of time for abnormal cells to become cancerous. But in women, especially women who have weaker immune system, they can actually start developing it much faster, and it might only take 5 to 10 years of time. So that's why we need to understand all these things with regards to HPV and how exactly HPV cancer can develop. So overall, when it comes to the symptoms of HPV, what we understand is that the symptoms, there are 4 major symptoms that we need to understand with regards to the HPV, with regards to the cervical cancer. And these are with regards to, first, there can be abnormal vaginal bleeding, unusual vaginal discharge, pain during intercourse, and also pelvic pain. So these are some of the symptoms with regards to cervical cancer, and if any one of these symptoms are seen in women, they are always advised that they should get it checked, so that early screening in many of the cases can also prevent this disease. So that's why this becomes very crucial. And overall, with regards to cervical cancer, there are various risk factors that can lead to cervical cancer. For example, tobacco, smoking. smoking has been seen to be one of the primary risk factors which is associated with cervical cancer. And that's why it is highly advised, because we know that when it comes to tobacco, the use of tobacco or smoking, it leads to a variety of problems, a lot of different kinds of diseases which are long-term diseases, a lot of other types of cancers also. For example, lung cancer, also one of the primary risk factors has been smoking or the use of tobacco. So that's why we need to understand that even in case of cervical cancer, smoking can be a major risk factor altogether. Similarly, we see that immunosuppression can also be one of the reasons for this. So overall, what we understand is that if you look at many of the preventive steps that are taken, many of the preventive steps we see that is related to the HPV vaccine, and how HPV vaccine can help in getting rid of many of these things. But when it comes to understanding of these risk factors, it is very important to understand what are the risk factors. For example, when you say immunosuppression in a manner is when the immune system is not doing very well. All right, when the immune system is not doing very well, that is something that can be called as immunosuppression. And in cases when immune system is not very strong, it is weaker than usual, then the chances of HPV developing into a cervical cancer can can be very high. So that's why we need to understand these kind of situations, where in these cases these can become risk factors. Similarly, long-term use of oral contraceptives also has been seen to be one of the crucial aspects of cervical cancer. Similarly, multiple full-term pregnancies also have been listed as one of the primary risk factors. Early sexual activity and multiple sexual partners could also lead to increase in the probability of HPV infection. And if it is a prolonged HPV infection, this is what is something that can develop into cases of cancer. So that's why there are some preventive measures that have to be taken. So for example, according to WHO, and these are the preventive measures that have been listed on WHO's website, that first, being vaccinated between the age of 9 to 14 years is one of the most effective ways. Alright, it is one of the most effective ways, and that's why we see that this has to be one of the primary goals. Similarly, screening from the age of 30. So this is also something that can lead to detection of cervical diseases, and this is something that if early detection happens, it can help in getting rid of the diseases early, and that's why it will not then develop into cancers. And then at any age with symptoms or concerns, early detection, as I told you, early detection followed by prompt quality treatment can cure cervical cancer. So that's why we have to look into all these aspects, and this is where we see that WHO has been looking towards various things that it can do. So for example, there is something that is called as 90-70-90. 90-70-90. There is this response by WHO. Now what exactly this response says is, first 90-70-90. Understand what 90-70-90 is. Now overall what we have seen is that WHO wants that by 2030, by the year 2030, all the countries have to make a pathway so that they can eliminate the cervical cancer cases. How exactly will they do that? First, 90% of girls should be vaccinated with HPV by the age of 15. So this is what first 90 denotes, that 90% of the girls should get HPV vaccination by the age of 15 years. Alright, by the time they are of the age of 15 years, they have to do this. Similarly, the next number is 70. So 70 means 70% of the women should be screened with high quality test between the ages of 30 to 45. So by the ages of, you can say by 35 to 45, 70% women should be screened by the ages 35 to 45 years. All right. 70% of the women should be screened with high quality test. So screened, I'll write the whole thing, with high quality test by the age of 35 to 45 years. And then the third 90 says that 90% of the women with cervical cancer disease should be receiving treatment by 2030. So this is what the program is about, that it says that 90% of the women, 90% women with cervical cancer should receive treatments. All right. So 90% of the women with cervical cancer or cervical diseases should receive treatments. So not cervical, so let me be clearer, cervical diseases. All right, should receive treatments by 2030. So that's why we see that there are all these things that are being done to ensure that cervical cancer cases in the world can be brought down, because increasingly it has been becoming an issue, and that's why it's not only about the treatment, and we need to understand, also educate people altogether to make them understand the severity of the situation that can develop, and that's why they should know what are the responses, what are the effective measures that they can take in ensuring that the cervical cancer cases all across the world can be brought down. So that's why this entire article has been basically talking about the same, that how exactly this is very, very important, and it talks about how this step that has been taken by the government of India is a very, very important and a very welcome step in the context of bringing down the cases of cervical cancer, and also educating people with regards to the importance of HPV vaccine and why it is very, very important for girls in the age of 9 to 14 years of age that they should get this vaccine. So that's why this vaccination program becomes very, very crucial, and in that context there is this one vaccine that has been also mentioned in this article, and this is Cervavac vaccine. So Cervavac vaccine is a vaccine that has been made by the Serum Institute, and this vaccine basically is used to prevent cervical, vulvar and vaginal cancer in women, and also helps against cancer and genital warts in both males as well as in females. So many a times, and for that's why you'll see that for many of the various countries, many of the countries also have been focusing not only on vaccination for girls but also vaccination for boys, so that further prevention of HPV infections can be done. So that's why we see that there are cumulative steps being taken all across the world. There are more than 100 countries now which in one way or the other have been looking towards a response against cervical cancer, and India now also adopting it as a part of union budget is a very, very welcome step in making these things, in bringing down these kind of cases further down. So that's why this is what this entire article or this editorial has been about. Now, looking at three articles that we have again in the editorials of today's newspaper. Now, these three somehow I would say are connected articles. So let's try to understand what these articles are. The first article is the determinant in more women in the job market. Now here what we basically see is that it talks about how exactly India has been trying to raise the participation of well-educated women in the job market, in the labor market, but there are certain issues that we need to understand, that what are, for example, why the participation in India is very low, what are the issues that we are facing, and what are the things that can be done going further. So for example, let's say if we talk about this article and some of the key points that have been mentioned in this article. This article basically, first and foremost, it mentions that women's participation in the economy has increased and that is why it will be very, very good for economic growth. So for example, this article highlights that the demand from the social scientists and the governments and also international organizations all across the world have been for increased women participation in the Indian labor market, and this can be a very, very important catalyst for economic growth of India. Now, when it talks about certain barriers, it has identified patriarchal system as one of the key barriers in the labor market for women, where the men dominate the family, dominate the community and the society, and it becomes the primary reason for women's participation being low, limiting their roles to only housemakers and caregivers. So that is something that we need to understand. Similarly, at the same time, it also talks about some of the uh, problems with regards to domestic work, that how we see that there is an undervaluation of the domestic work. It discusses how exactly women's domestic work is unpaid, invisible to the local policies, and also considered to be inferior, leading to their very, you can say in a manner, marginalized scenario in the labor market. Similarly, it also talks about certain proposed measures for the improvement in this scenario, that there are technological and infrastructural support that can be provided to reduce the burden of the unpaid domestic work. Similarly, policy interventions are required so that they can incorporate the unpaid work into economic policies, and also at the same time redistribution of the household work to also include men, also trying to prompt gender equality in also household work. So that's why there are these things that have been mentioned. At the same time, it also talks about the exploitation of domestic workers, that how this article has also been raising concerns about the exploitation of the domestic workers and India's non-ratification of the international conventions which are aimed at protecting the rights of the domestic work. So there are all these things that have been mentioned in this particular article. So overall, it talks about how we need to understand what the labor participation, how the labor participation of women needs to work in the Indian market, and how we need to also value the work which is being done by the women outside the labor market, which is not really valued in terms of the parity or even in terms of the payments and the kind of rights that they should have with regards to even the domestic work. So that is why there is one, this is what is being mentioned. So this is the context of this article, that we see that there is a growing demand from the social scientists, from the governments and international organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF, that women's participation in the economy or labor market should increase to promote economic growth of India. And this is also believed that when women's participation rate, which is one of the lowest in Asia, increases, it will bring prosperity to the Indian economy. That their participation becomes very, very crucial for India's economy is what this article has been arguing. We'll discuss more about this, but let's also look at the second article that we have, and this second article is Fall and Rise in Women's Work Participation. Now, what is the context of this article? This article talks about various data sets with regards to women's employment in India. So, for example, between the ages of 15 and above, we have seen that it fluctuates around 42% between 1993-94, and then declines to 28% by 2011-12, and then again drops further down to 22% by 2017-18. But from 2017 onwards, we have seen a miraculous jump, and now it has reached up to 36% in 2022-23. So this is what this article talks about. Now, when it comes to this article, we need to understand certain things again in the context of what the article says. First, the article is saying that look, there is a fluctuating work participation rate with regards to women. So for example, it describes the fluctuation and the recent trends with regards to all these data that we have seen, and this is based on the National Sample Survey, the NSS, and also the periodic labor force surveys which are done. So that's why there are two data sets that are being used. One, National Sample Surveys, NSS data, and then the periodic labor force surveys, periodic labor force surveys. So these survey reports are being taken into account, and the data is basically based on these surveys. So overall, there is a debate that we have on the interpretation of the trends. We see that there are two opposing views, as the article also says, that there is one side which has been taken, or one set of data being presented by the people who are pro-government in a manner, you can say, and there is another set of data being represented by the people who are against the government, or you can say in a manner they have an anti-government stance. So in a manner you will see that there, depending on the political beliefs of many of the social scientists, they are representing this data and basically inferring this data in two different ways. So that's why we have to understand the contrasting interpretations of these data. One, for example, views the declines as a sign of increasing job availability or growing prosperity, allowing the women also to focus on the family and also other attributes which rises the employment and job opportunities for them, increases the job opportunities for them. Then at the same time, it also talks about agricultural versus non-agricultural employments. That it also notes that a significant portion of the change in women's participation rate is also due to their involvement in the agricultural work, particularly in the families who are related to agriculture. Similarly, it also talks about the challenges in measurements of the data that has been represented. That it highlights that there are inadequacies in the current surveys in capturing the full scope of women's work, particularly in the rural settings where women's work spans both as paid and unpaid activities. So this is where you can say that in a manner this article is also related to the last article that we saw, where we are talking about how domestic work is seen as an unpaid activity and it is not even seen as an economic activity. It is not a part of any of the policies and the frameworks, etc. So that's why we need to understand the value of the unpaid work as well and also start looking towards that. And especially in the rural settings, this disparity is even something that grows further. So this is what this article also tries to highlight. Then it also talks about certain concerns with regards to the decline in India's statistical system, and also talks about how we see that there is an impact on getting reliable employment data, or improving upon the methods and the quality of the data collection, etc. So there are all these things that it talks about, and we'll discuss about this also in detail. Then there is this third article about the burden of women in construction. Now here in this article, in India, it talks about that the construction sector is one of the largest employers of the migrant female labor force, and especially from those from the ST and the SC households. And in several parts of the country, especially in seasons where agricultural work is scarce, the construction industry becomes a vital source of employment for women. So here again we are talking about the employment scenario in women, and here it talks about construction sector, that how in construction sector we see that there is a seasonality in the employment and how it becomes very crucial, especially when it comes to non-agricultural scenarios or non-agricultural seasons. So first it talks about the quality of employment concerns, that it has been talking about the quality of employment in terms of skill development, social protection, work-life balance, income and employment security. All these things is something that has been mentioned in this article. Similarly, it also talks about the various surveys, the data that have been published by various institutions and organizations, where for example, when it talks about the average time that women spend on paid employment or also unpaid domestic work, and how in childcare also they have to at the same time play a very important role. So within the construction sector, doing all this at the same time is not going to be very easy for them. So that's why there are challenges that they are facing with regards to all these multiple activities. It describes how women are very often engaged in simultaneous activities. They have to try and balance all the paid work with also domestic work, with also all the responsibilities with regards to their childcare, and that's why they are forced into multiple laborious tasks at the same time to meet and also meet the wage thresholds at the same time. And then also it talks about there a lack of training and a lack of safety measures that we see in, especially in the context of construction industry. It points out how we see that there is a reluctance of the employers to train women and to provide them with the safety equipments, so that and that's why it also limits their opportunities for skilled work, and also it also hampers their wages. That is something that also limits them from having better wages in the same construction industry, where men are being paid much higher wages as compared to the women in the same sector, maybe also for the same kind of job. So that's why it talks about all these issues, and it also says at the same time that there is a potential for sector growth. It suggests that with appropriate investment such as in skill training, in improving the social protection, and this construction sector has a potential to absorb more women into productive paid work. So that's why there are all these things that these three articles talk about, and that's why I said that these three articles have to be seen in a very connected manner. So first, there is something that is being mentioned here in these articles, and this is about labor market. That what do we mean by labor market? So labor market basically is something that can be referred to as the job market arena, where the employers and the employees interact to exchange labor for compensation, where you are doing some work for some institution, some firms or some company, and you are getting paid for it. So overall we see that it is something that operates through, you can say, in a manner through the demand and the supply dynamics of the market, of the labor market. So that's why the employers here, they would seek to hire labor at probably the lowest possible cost, and while the employees will try to find work that offers them the best possible wages and the best possible working conditions. So that's why this labor market will try to balance between the two, where somebody who wants to employ you does not want to pay you, and at the same time when you are trying to seek any job, you want to pay it the most that you can, right? So then the labor market basically is something that will be a balance between these two, the supply and demand in any given sector. Now, overall, this labor market, when we say labor market, it is also influenced by various different factors. For example, the kind of economic conditions that we have in any given economy, then the kind of government policies that we have in various different sectors, the technological advancements in many of these sectors, and also many of the demographic trends also tend to support or tend to influence the labor market in any given country. So labor market, now in the context of when we are talking about women's labor market, this is where the article is talking about something very crucial. Now overall what we see is that if you think, if you take example of the women, obviously they are almost 50% of the population, where engagement of the women, although they are almost 50% of the population, the engagement of women in the workforce, it is something which remains significantly low. And there is a situation where you can say that it only underlines how grave this social issue is, and also it is something that represents a missed economic opportunity for our country. And that's why this discussion, this entire discussion is something that uh, is going to revolve around that, our understanding of the barriers that hinder women's participation, the trends that are observed over the years in their participation, and the various crucial aspects or various crucial steps that we need to take to ensure a more inclusive and productive economic environment for the women. So first, to understand their challenges, what are the various issues and challenges that women face? That overall, when it comes to a woman, they have to balance their life today between the paid wages, between the paid work that they are doing, and at the same time probably the unpaid work that is never even accounted for in any given economy or in any given policy. So where very casually when you say that somebody is a housewife, or maybe also in the context somebody is just a housewife. Now being just a housewife is also a full-time job that starts at 6 a.m. in the morning and probably ends at 11 p.m. at night. So it is something which is somewhere around, it is something that spans for almost 15 to 18 hours of time, and something which is said to be just a housewife. So unfortunately, this is a state that we need to understand and realize the value of this activity as well. That's something which in a manner can be said to be an unpaid domestic work. So that's why we need to understand the various aspects of the challenges and the issues that the women are facing altogether. So, for example, when we look at the heart of the issue, we see that there is a very deep rooted patriarchy in the society which traditionally has been placing women in the domestic roles. Whether you talk about, and I'm not specifically pointing out only the Indian society, you look towards the societies all across the world and you'll find patterns which are pretty similar. Yes, it depends on the level of development, the level of market value, and also the level of education and literacy. But at the same time, we find that at the heart of all these issues, uh, the problems being faced by women all across the world are pretty similar. Where when we look at the traditional places where women are looked towards, moved from the domestic roles, significantly limiting their roles and access to the opportunities in the labor market. And this is not just a cultural dilemma, but also at the same time a very severe economic setback for any given economy. For instance, according to the International Labour Organization, increasing women's forced participation to match men's participation could boost India's economy or India's GDP by 27%. Yet our understanding and measurement of women's work participation has been uh, very fraught and challenge, and there have been fraught with various challenges. The surveys very often they overlook the underrepresented, very extensive contribution of women, particularly in the informal sector. And very striking example has been the measurement gap which has been found in various surveys. For example, the definition of work itself very often fails to include the unpaid labor in the women's contribution to the economy. So that's why we need to understand various issues and challenges that we have. For example, the first challenge that we can point out are the societal norms and the gender roles. The traditional gender roles in India very often have dictated that women are primarily responsible for household work, and that's why they have to do more of caregivers task. And this cultural expectation limits the women's time and opportunity to engage in paid employment. Moreover, at the same time, the societal norms can also restrict women's mobility and also their ability to work in various occupations or industries which are deemed unsuitable for the women. So that's why these societal norms and gender roles that have been predisposed to women, that can be one of the challenges that we see in the context of the challenges that women are facing. So that's why largely when we say that their roles have to be confined to only being caregivers, and something which is also not counted as an economic activity, it is not something that counts in paid employment. This is also something that is a problem, and this restricts them from engaging in paid employment. Then after that, we see that there is a lower workforce participation. That overall, when we say that they make half of the population, but women's workforce participation rates in India are significantly lower than that of men. And particularly, this is again something that goes back to domestic care responsibilities. That is something which is an unpaid work, and that also leaves them with very limited time and flexibility to pursue something which is an employment opportunity. Then again, at the same time, the wage gap and employment or employment inequality is also a big challenge. The women who do participate in the labor market, very often they also face wage disparity as compared to their male counterparts. And this is where we see that this gender wage gap is very evident across various sectors, whether it comes to areas where typically women are engaged less than men for similar work, and Additionally, at the same time, what we see is that women are also more likely to be employed in informal sector, which often, very often, we see that they have lower wages with regards to the job security, and even with regards to the kind of employment benefits that many of the formal sectors will be giving. So that is also one challenge that we face. So lower workforce participation because of largely being associated mostly with domestic work. Then wage gap and employment inequality. So where we see that in the formal sector there has been a lot of wage gap problems compared to their male counterparts, and employment inequality, where we see that many of the areas or area of the sectors are typically seen to be not suitable, or deemed to be, not seemed to be, they are deemed to be unsuitable for women. And that's why what we see is that many of the women, largely they also are employed in the informal sector. They are employed in the informal sector where wages anyway are lower, and the employment benefits also are pretty less. Job security also is pretty less. So that's why we see that there are all these issues. So they are employed in the informal sector where we see that first there are lower wages, low job security, and then at the same time fewer benefits. So that's why there are all these concerns that we have with regards to the labor employment, especially in the informal sector. Then limited access to education and skill development. Now in this particular scenario, while we have seen that there have been progresses that have been made in women's education in India, disparities still remain. Particularly in the rural areas, there are a lot of disparities. There is a limited access to quality education and vocational training, and this restricts women's employment opportunities to low skilled and low paying jobs. So that is also one of the challenges, and especially in the context of the rural areas, we see that these are issues. So especially this is again especially in the rural areas. Let me just go to, so point number 4 wise, this is especially in rural areas, and this is why we see that they are restricted to low paying, low skill jobs. All right, low paying, low skill jobs. Then after that, the fifth point here is occupational segregation. Now occupational segregation meaning that women are very often concentrated in certain sectors only and certain occupations only, such as agriculture, domestic work, and low skilled services. And these occupational segregation not only reflects but also reinforces the gender stereotypes, and all this is something that also limits women in their career options and also in their earning potential. So that's why this is something that we need to understand from the perspective of what's happening. So when we say occupational segregation, we are saying that there are limited sectors where they are being employed. So that is one problem. Then at the same time, this is something that reinforces their gender stereotypes, and that's why their earning potential and career options are limited. So that's why they have limited earning potential and career options. Then after that, we also talk about the workplace harassment and the safety concerns. This has been one of the major challenges, that safety concerns both during the commute and also at the workplace, they are both a very significant challenge for women. And especially when it comes to workforce harassment and the lack of safe, women-friendly work environments, this further discourages women from participating in the labor force. Then at the same time, lack of work work-life balance support, the absence of supportive policies and the facilities such as, let's say, flexible working hours or better parental leaves or child care services, all this makes it very challenging for women, especially for mothers, to balance their work and family responsibilities. Then at the same time, discriminatory practices in hiring and promotion. Here also we have seen that women very often face discrimination in hiring, in promotion, and also in professional development opportunities. Stereotypes about women's role and ability can also hinder their career advancements at a later stage as well. And then lastly, policy and legal framework gaps also a big challenge, because although we see that there are laws and policies which are aimed at promoting gender equality in the workforce, in implementing the gaps, etc., we see that lack of awareness and insufficient enforcement mechanisms, they also weaken the entire effectiveness. So this again we have to understand from the perspective of more than having the policy, than also a lack of enforcement. Lack of enforcement. So that's why we see that there are all these challenges that women face because of these problems. So overall, when you look at the trends in women employment, we see that when you look at the analysis of these trends using the data that have been published, whether the National Sample Survey or the Periodic Labor Force Survey, it has been revealing a very worrisome fluctuation, as the second article was discussing, that from a very stable work participation rate of around 42% in the 1990s to a very sharp decline to almost just 22% in 2017-18, which again we have seen that there has been a surge to almost 36% by 2020-23. Now these figures, they paint a very complex picture of the Indian labor market. Such fluctuations have also sparked a lot of debates. For example, there are some of the views that who say that this indicates a decline in the job availability or growing prosperity that allows women to choose not to work. And while others also see that this is a sign of economic transformation and increasing job opportunities. And significantly, the agricultural employment has been a critical factor here, where women's participation on family farms, especially witnessing a very important change that we have seen, that from in early 90s, the data says that there was almost 23% participation of women, to in 2017 where we see that just 10% of participation has been seen in 2017, which has now again improved to or increased to 20% in the 2022 data. So 1990s data says that in agricultural families the participation is almost 23%. The early 1990s, let me write early 1990s, that early 1990s the participation here, women's participation on agricultural families is 23%, whereas in 2017 data, as the article says, it drops down to almost 10%, and in 2022 it again picks up and becomes 20%. So that's why we have seen that there are these disparities that we have in the data. So overall, that's why we see that there are all these things that have been seen in the activities, and many of the activities, especially let's say when we talk about the construction activity, as the article has talked about, traditionally we have seen that it has been male dominated, whereas we see that although it has been male dominated, we see that there are surveys which has revealed that women in construction also have been participating a lot, and their average spend, I mean when the overall the data was collected, what we see is that overall average for women employed in the construction activities were far more, almost you can say double of what we see in construction activities, were almost double of the amount of time that they have spent in the unpaid work, that is the domestic work. And then again they also have to give time to their the child care related work. So it was said that almost 8 hours of job plus 4 hours of domestic work plus almost 2 hours of child care. So all these are the things that women have to balance between. And that's why despite a very vital income that it provides, the quality of employment is very concerning, that women are very often engaged in labor activities or labor tasks which do not really have very adequate safety measures, and that is where the problems start to rise for them. So addressing these challenges through interventions are very, very important, and that is where we need to also understand the various measures that can be taken for improvement. What are the various pathways that can be taken for improvement? So that's why this is something that we need to understand through various aspects of what the government has been doing and what the government can further do. So in that context, there are these 5 important points that you need to understand, and in this context, what exactly have we seen government doing and what are the future things that can be done in this context. So overall, first and foremost, when we look at the various measures, for example, so when we look at the legislative measures, so we have seen that over a period of time there have been various legislative measures that have been taken by the government. So for example, if you talk about there is a very, in 1976, I believe, the Equal Remuneration Act was passed, that there should be equal pay for equal work for both men and women, and this was 1976. Similarly, there has been the Maternity Benefit Act, which was also amended in 2017, and it increased the paid the paid maternity leave to up to 26 weeks in India. Then apart from that, we have seen that there is Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace Act of 2013 as well, which also has been one of the major legislative measure. Then at the same time, employment and skill development initiatives. So here when we look at all these different initiatives, Manrega can be seen as one of the major activities here, where it guarantees 100 days of wage employment per year, especially to the rural households. And here we see that a significant amount of benefits also have been going to women in the rural areas. Then apart from that, we have the Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana. So you have Manrega that you can talk about. So Manrega is something that you can talk about here. Then apart from that, you can also talk about Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana. So Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana. Now this Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana basically is something that provides skill training to the youth, and also special emphasis has been given to improve the participation of women in the workforce through skill development. So that is why this is one of the initiatives that have been taken. Then apart from that, we see that there have been other initiatives as well. So for example, Deen Dayal Antyodaya Yojana is also there. That is basically National Rural Livelihood Mission. So overall, we have seen that these are schemes that have been that have aimed towards decreasing the poverty levels by trying to promote diversified and gainful self-employment opportunities, and also skilled wage employment opportunities for the women in these sectors. Then apart from that, there are other financial inclusion and support schemes as well. So for example, if you again it would be, a lot of these schemes have been there. So just to point out some of these schemes, there is the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, for example. Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana. So this Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana basically is something that provides loans to women entrepreneurs so that they can start their own small businesses. Then there are other schemes, for example, let's say Stand Up India. So Stand Up India tries to support women entrepreneurs by also offering loans for a lot of different types of enterprises in manufacturing, services and the trading sectors. So that's why we see that this also becomes very, very crucial. So you can write about this also. So you have the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, then you have the Stand Up India program. Then apart from that, you can talk about education and empowerment, that there are schemes like Beti Bachao Beti Padhao scheme, which also has been trying to generate awareness and improve the efficiency of welfare services which are intended for girls in India, and including especially when it comes to education, which is very, very crucial for their future employment prospects. Then apart from that, so you can talk about the Beti Padhao Beti Bachao. And then apart from that, there are other schemes that you have. For example, you have the Sukanya Samriddhi Yojana, which also tries to encourage the parents to invest in their daughter's future education and also marriage expenses through a government backed savings scheme. So that's why this also becomes very, very crucial. So you can mention this also, Sukanya Samriddhi Yojana. So that's why, I mean, I'm just taking some of the examples that we have here. Similarly, there are social empowerment schemes that have been there, and these schemes also have been there. For example, providing daycare facilities for children of working mothers and ensuring that the burden of child care can be distributed. Similarly, there is the Ujjwala scheme. For example, you can talk about how it would have a positive impact on the health of women and children by providing them with clean cooking fuel and also reducing the time that is spent on collecting firewood, and thus trying to increase their time that they have, that they can invest in paid work. So that's why there are all these things. Apart from that, you can talk about further improvements as well, that we have to enhance the education and training in women so that we can empower women with the skills that are required for higher paying jobs. Similarly, workforce or workplace reforms are also required so that we can implement more flexible work arrangements for women, and also trying to enhance the maternity and paternity benefits so that this can also improve their participation. Then also encouraging more of entrepreneurship in women and ensuring that they can also drive economic growth and job creations. Social awareness campaigns can also be run so that they can help in reducing the stigma and encourage more equitable distribution of domestic responsibilities between men and women. And then there are policy enforcements that we can do, and that will also strengthen the enforcement of existing laws and the policies that we have in the workforce and in the labor market. So that's why there are all these things. And so whatever these three articles have covered, we just have tried to go one step further and give you the examples of what all are the issues, challenges, and what are the various measures being taken by the government, and also for further improvement, what are the things that the government can do so that we can ensure better participation of women in the labor market. Now then, there is another article, and this is an article in the editorial page, page number 15, Bridging the Gender Gap in Health Research. Now, overall, what it says is that recently there was a report that was released by World Economic Forum and McKinsey, and this was about closing the women's health gap. Now, this has talked about the profound disparity between men's and women's health worldwide. Now, understand what are we talking about. We see that although there have been longer life expectancies for both men and women, overall, when we look at this picture, the picture for women is not that great as compared to men. Sorry. For example, despite living together, the report says that despite living longer than men in when it comes to life expectancy, we see that women spend 25% more of their lives in poor health. Health burdens, especially in case of women, we see that they have very heavily impacted their lives, and they have ripple effects in a lot of different ways for the entire society, in a manner, you can say. And that's why, to address these issues, there is this particular report that was published by World Economic Forum and McKinsey Health Institute. Now, overall, this report addresses the root cause of women's health gap, especially focuses on some of the key aspects of what leads to the health gap between men and women. And it has talked about a number of ways in which we can close this gap between men and women, from maybe incentivizing new financial models, in investing in women-centric schemes and new models. And then at the same time, it also tries to address some of the issues that we see with regards to women's health. So overall, when it comes to this scenario, what we need to understand is where the problems lie and what do we see in the context of today's world. That investing in women's health, which is more often than not only about reproductive health of women, is something which is not really, which does not have to be only the crux of everything. When you look at 2023, the data says that as of 2023, women are 49.75% of the entire population, and despite these numbers, women's health issues have been predominantly viewed through only a very narrow lens of gynecology and also reproductive concerns. So that's why we need to grow out of only reproductive health for women and look at a holistic view for women's health. So that's why it talks about systematic biases that we have in medical data collection that also has led to a lot of issues here. And then it also talks about and highlights the importance of prioritizing women's health and also achieving health equality in the world. Now in India, what we see is that because of the genetic predisposition, it makes the population more susceptible to diseases like diabetes, and that also underscores the need for tailoring the health research in India accordingly. So there are certain key actions for meaningful change that we need to understand, and that's why it tries to analyze the genetic or rather the gender differences that whether it is in clinical trials or whether including the gender specific information on drug labels, and also trying to recruit more of women in clinical trials. Now this is where it becomes very very crucial to also apply a gender lens to data analysis as well, and also try to use more precise terminology with regards to gender and sex. So that's why there are all these things that we need to understand. That overall this entire report also has been saying that it's not only about the fact that we see that women in general have been living in poorer health conditions as compared to women, although life expectancy wise they live longer than men, yet they are spending more time under poor health conditions. So this is something that has been highlighted by the report, and the report says that the primary problem starts with the data collection itself, where the data collection in health sector largely is tilted towards men. That if clinical trials happen, in clinical trials also the participation of men compared to women is higher, and that leads to these kind of issues growing further. So that's why it has talked about encouraging women's participation in research and science, which becomes very crucial for developing inclusive and effective healthcare solutions. Then at the same time, it also talks about an overarching goal that it is to create a future where health is equitable, it is effective, it is for everyone, and it recognizes good health as a fundamental human right both for men and women. Then at the same time, that's why this entire report becomes very very crucial, that it talks about the opportunities to improve lives and economies, and finds that women, although they are living longer, they have been living in poorer health conditions compared to men, almost 25% poorer health conditions compared to men. So that's why there are all these issues that it has talked about, and the need that we have so that we could look towards a holistic approach towards women health. Now in India, for example, it talks about that top 4 of the 10 conditions which contribute to highest health burdens for women are conditions that also affect both men and women similarly. But overall we see that in case of women, the problems are higher. So for example, we see that in certain disorders they are higher in number. In terms of heart diseases, they have been seen in higher in number. In case of respiratory infections also, we have seen that they are higher in number. So overall we see that there are all these conditions in case of India also that has been highlighted in this particular scenario. So overall, when it talks about the root cause, this report, when it talks about the root cause, when it talks about the root causes of all these issues, so there are 4 primary things that it has talked about. So 4 primary things. First, it talks about science, it talks about care delivery, investment and data. So there are 4 aspects. One is about science, one is about care delivery, one is about investment, and then about data. Investment and data. So there are these 4 points that has been highlighted as the core root causes. So now the report basically talks about all these causes of the gap in of this gap that is very, very important to address at the moment. And that's why, for example, improvement in science. So improvement in science will encourage or ensure a very complete understanding of women's biology, as well as a better classification of women's symptoms and also manifestation of many of these diseases. So that's why this becomes very crucial. Then the data shortages on the health issues and symptoms, they particularly become very relevant to women's issues, and the data has to be segregated and classified accordingly. Similarly, reduced barriers to the care and enhanced quality of care for women should also be targeted through increased education and improving the accessibility and affordability, timely diagnosis, and also the kinds of choices for treatment that the women have. And then lastly, with regards to increasing the investment in women's health also becomes very, very crucial to ensure increase in understanding and prevention and diagnosis and the treatment for the women's health condition becomes also essential. So that's why we see that this article talks about all these aspects of how exactly it can lead to economic growth. For example, according to the report, investing in women's health has shown a positive result on investment, a positive ROI, return on investment. What it says is that investing for every $1 that is invested in women's health, it gives you up to $3 in economic growth. So that's why $1 of investment in women's health leads to up to $3 of economic growth. So that's why this report has been trying to highlight all these things and why it becomes very, very crucial for us to also look into all these issues related to women's health. Now coming to an article related to polity, and this is Supreme Court asks if Maharashtra Speaker contradicted the verdict. Now what exactly is this article saying? The Supreme Court, which was led by the Chief Justice of India, Chandrachud, questioned whether Maharashtra Speaker had contradicted a constitutional bench judge by using legislative majority. We'll discuss what is legislative majority, to declare the Chief Minister Eknath Shinde's faction as the real Shiv Sena. Now the Chief Justice noted that Speaker's reliance on the legislative majority to identify the real political party seemed contrary to the court's guidance that was provided last year in the month of May, which emphasized that Speaker should not be influenced by legislative majorities in deciding of the anti-defection cases. Now what we see is that in the month of January, the Speaker had decided that on disqualifying disqualifying proportions against the faction led by the Chief Minister Eknath Shinde, and against the rival faction that is seen with Uddhav Thackeray. Now under the anti-defection laws, it was declared that Shinde's camp or Shinde's faction is the true party based on the legislative majority at the time of the split in June 2022. Now, a constitutional bench that was led by the Chief Justice, it has previously noted that that the Speaker's decision should not solely be dependent on which group holds a majority in the Legislative Assembly, and it also had emphasized on the fact that the leadership outside the Assembly and the support from the political wing are also relevant factors. Now overall, it also highlighted that there is a distinction between legislative wing of a party and the political wing of the party, and that's why it suggested that the real party faction should be determined based on the political will support and not just the legislative numbers on the floor. So that's why we see that the advocates who had criticize the speaker, where you also had people like Kapil Sibbal and Abhishek Manu Singhvi, etc. So they basically had criticized the speaker for not acknowledging the 2018 Shiv Sena party constitution, which had named uh, Uddhav Thackeray as the president, and instead it had referred to the 1999 constitution. So that's why we see that there were these kind of arguments that were put forward. On the other side, when we see that the opposing views that were put forward by Harish Salve, he claimed that Thakeray's camp, it documents present to it documents basically the documents that were presented to the speaker, they were actually, according to him, were fabricated and noted a very similar case which was pending in the Bombay High Court. And that is where he argued that this is something which is very where the simultaneous petition should be seen in multiple courts over the same issue, and that's why these kind of objections were raised. Now, despite these objections, the Supreme Court decided to proceed with the case and it scheduled further arguments for further commencing the same in the month of April. April 8th, I think, is the date that has been given, and that's why all the records for disqualification of the proceedings from the Speaker's office, Maharashtra Speaker's office, have been asked for. So that's why this is basically the context to the case. Now, overall, that's why when we talk about this, it is the debate over which should be called as the real faction in terms of the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra. Now, when it comes to the anti-defection law in India, which also is called as the 10th schedule, which becomes a part, which is the 10th schedule in the Indian Constitution, it basically talks about, it was added in the Constitution in 1985, and it was designed to prevent political defections which were motivated by the lure of office or maybe similar considerations. So that's why the basic objective here was, the basic purpose was to curb the political defections by legislators, which can despecialize the elected government and also undermine the foundation of the Indian democracy itself. Now, when it comes to the definition of defection here, the definition of the defection here says that a member of the parliament or of the state legislature party is deemed to have defected if either voluntarily they give up the membership of the party, or they disobey the directives of the party leadership on a vote. And that's why this is not considered to be a defection if the complete political party itself merges with another party. So that's why we see that there are these defections, or the definitions for defection has been given, and then there is something for the disqualification of the members who have defected under the conditions outlined in the 10th schedule, and they can be disqualified from their post. The decision of the disqualified is basically made by the chairman of the Rajya Sabha, and also for the Legislative Council, and also by the speaker in the Lok Sabha, in the Legislative Assembly. So that's why we see that there are a lot of things with regards to the anti-defection law. And also when we look at the disqualifications and also some of the exceptions that the law has allowed, we see that if the party merges with another party, provided that at least 2/3 of the legislatures are in favor of the merger, in such cases neither the members who have decided to merge nor those who have stayed with the original party will face any kind of disqualification. So that's why we see that in the context of all these scenarios of anti-defection law, this all case on debate with regards to Shiv Sena has been going on. Now, a very particular word that has been mentioned in this article is legislative majority. Now, legislative majority basically is where we are saying that more than half of the members of the legislative body, such as the parliament or even the assembly, they belong to a single political party or the coalition. So that's why we see that this majority enables the party or the coalition to pass laws and potentially control the agenda of the legislative body. So that's why the speaker who determined which faction is the actual faction on the basis of legislative majority is what has been questioned by the Supreme Court, that it should not have been done on that basis, but there are other parameters that were set in the earlier ruling, and that should have been used as the parameter for deciding which is the real faction of Shiv Sena. So that is basically where we are with regards to this particular ruling currently. Then coming to page number 10, article which talks about Kerala comes up with a long short-term measure to prevent man-animal conflict. Now overall, when it comes to, and if we talk about what exactly this article says, the context of this article, the context is that a smart elephant fence is among the long-term measures which have been proposed by Kerala government to prevent the maneuvering of wild elephants from reaching the human habitations, reducing the instances of the conflict in Wayanad. Now overall, what exactly is this article saying? Some of the basic points that the article discusses. First is that there will be a smart elephant fence, introducing a smart elephant fence so that it can prevent the wild animals or wild elephants to be exact from coming into the human areas and reducing the cases of human wildlife conflict in Wayanad. Now overall, it talks about also the removal of the undergrowth in many of the private states with the help of the workers from the employment guarantee schemes. Then it also says that they would also try to eradicate the invasive species, the invasive plants, to eradicate all of them, and that also is an effort to remove these plants and growths so that they so that they can support natural vegetation in the regeneration of the natural vegetation and also improving the wildlife habitats. So overall, we see that there are these things that they have talked. They also have talked about charging an entry fee, considering charging an entry fee for private vehicles into the forested areas. Similarly, for fencing of the areas for protection. Then also talks about some short-term measures. There are 17 short-term measures that they have talked about to mitigate the man-animal conflict. So they also then have talked about the interstate coordination and how these coordinations might also help. Then also implementing early warning systems and drone surveillances. So there are all these things that have been mentioned in the article with regards to reducing these cases. And lastly, it also talks about compensation and the support that can be provided here. So overall, it might overall lead to a growth in ecotourism destinations, so and in closing those destinations as well, so that you can improve upon the wildlife areas and the natural habitat for these situations. And then lastly, it also talks about how community and various different things that can be done in this context. Now overall, just understand, I mean, when we look at this article, that okay, there are long-term and short-term measures that the article talks about. We basically are looking towards the prevention of human wildlife conflict. Now, from the perspective of human wildlife conflict, first and foremost is about community engagement and education. We need to educate the local communities about the wildlife behavior and the importance of biodiversity and also the measures so that they can live harmoniously with the wildlife in any given area. And that is also about, let's say, training of the people and also how to avoid the attraction from the wildlife in these kind of areas. So that's why one thing is community engagement and education. Right? So that they have to be trained, they have to understand the various aspects of what can go wrong and what they have to do, what is their responsibility. Then also one thing, as the article also talks about, early warning systems, that we need to install early warning systems so that we can avoid these conflicts, especially given the areas of elephants. Then maybe also physical barriers, that we can have physical barriers such as fences or walls so that we can separate the human settlements from the wildlife habitats. So smart fencing that has been discussed here, that also can be a very important aspect. So we are talking about physical barriers. Then what next? Having a better land use planning, that we implement strategies so that better land use planning can be done, so that we can avoid the habitats from fragmenting, and that is something that will ensure that development projects are also minimizing the impact on the wildlife corridors and the habitats of the areas. So better wildlife, or you can say better land use pattern or better land use planning can be done. Then at the same time, habitat restoration and protection, as the article also talks about here, that we can basically have a better habitat, right? We can have better habitat restoration and protection, better habitat restoration and protection, where even preventing habitat fragmentation becomes a very important aspect. Then also maybe looking at alternative livelihoods for many of the people, supporting the alternative livelihoods for especially the communities which are heavily dependent on agriculture or livestock in these kind of areas. That also can be very important. And this also could include promoting tourism or promoting crafts, etc. Then also having maybe compensation and insurance schemes for many of the people who are living in these kind of areas, as in the article also has been mentioned. Similarly, having farm practices, agricultural practices which are wildlife friendly, so that it is not hampering the wildlife areas and wildlife overall. Similarly, it can also be about waste management, because we see that improving waste management practices to avoid any attraction of the wildlife into the human settlements is also a very important aspect of what can be done. And then of course, having a better policy framework, a better legal framework, that can also support in avoiding any kind of conflict that can have in these areas. And then at the same time also facilitating research and monitoring in these conditions, that conducting ongoing research and monitoring of wildlife movements and understanding their behaviors can also help us adapt properly in these kind of situations. So that's why there are a lot of ways. One of the various many important, very important ways also is to build corridors and crossings for the wildlife, so that we can create the wildlife corridors and we can create passes for them, or maybe underpasses for them through the highways and the roads, so that we can reduce the wildlife deaths as well in these kind of situations. So that's why there are all these aspects of what we can do with regards to the prevention of human wildlife conflict. So that's why we need to understand some of these concepts well. Then lastly, coming to the two articles which are related to the prelims examination. The first one is Center to Rope in ISRO to provide internet in 80 remote villages. Now what is this article? Now this article basically talks about what exactly the Tribal Affairs Ministry is planning. The Tribal Affairs Ministry is planning a collaboration with ISRO so that they can install VSAT, and we'll discuss about VSAT here. VSAT stations in 80 tribal villages across certain states, the states being Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha and Maharashtra. Alright, so where exactly? Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha and Maharashtra. So these four states have been chosen to provide internet services. Now the initiative basically is aiming to improve the connectivity in the remote or hard to reach kind of tribal areas, and it becomes a part of a pilot project which is probably going to be expanded later. So that's why here we see that there will be a collaboration between Tribal Affairs Ministry and ISRO to do this. And this proposal actually was discussed in a meeting that happened earlier this week, and this becomes a part of this entire scenario. Now in this context we need to understand what do we mean by VSAT, right? So what we are talking about in this context is VSAT. So let's try to also understand what do we mean by VSAT, what is VSAT, and how exactly do we look at VSAT, because here we are trying to identify these villages where you can connect these villages through satellites, right, through satellites, and through satellites we want to provide internet to these kind of areas. So now when it comes to VSAT becomes very, very crucial, because this has been one of the ways in which government traditionally also has been trying to reach areas which are hard to reach. So that's why we see that VSAT in communication also has been very, very important in ensuring better communication, in ensuring satellite communication. So what is VSAT? VSAT basically stands for very small aperture terminal. All right, very small aperture terminal. I'll write it here, very small aperture terminal. Now what do we mean by this? All right, what do we mean by this? So this basically becomes a satellite communication technology that uses small dish antenna, as you can see here in the picture, that it uses small dish antenna, and this dish antenna for the transmission and reception of data, voice and video signals. All right, data, voice and video signals all can be transmitted with the help of VSAT. So data, voice and video all can be transmitted with the help of VSAT through the satellites. Now these terminals that we have, these terminals will communicate through the satellites which are there in the geostationary orbit. So you have these satellites which are there in the geostationary Earth orbit, and what we see is that the transmission basically that happens, these terminals will communicate with these satellites in the geostationary Earth orbit, and they can be deployed virtually anywhere in the world. Now this is something that makes it very ideal for providing internet and communication services in the remote rural areas where traditionally ground-based telecommunication infrastructure is very limited, or maybe even you can say non-existent altogether. Now overall, when it comes to this, VSAT networks can actually operate in various different configurations, where here we are talking about data communication. Initially what we have seen is that data VSAT based video communication also has been enabled by the government of India, where we talk about something called as tele-education, where we have seen that tele-education has been one of the ways in which the government always has been trying to make the use of VSAT. So that's why this technology actually supports a wide range of applications, where it is broadband internet connection, whether it is about video conferencing, whether it is data transfer, or even in case of remote education or even healthcare services. So for example, tele-education and also telemedicine, where they try to provide these services to far off areas, remote areas where normally ground stations are not available. So that's why we see that this is where these two will be able to communicate. And VSAT based video networks have been very common and have been used as services. For example, Byjus, almost 15 years back, when we used to provide online classes, back then, I mean 15 years back, when we actually had online classes, live online classes, we used to use VSAT back then, where one class will be running, let's say, in one of the cities like Bangalore, and simultaneously it will be telecasted to our centers in Chennai, in Delhi, in other areas as well, in Hyderabad as well. So we used to use it back in 2010 and 11, and from there on, I mean, now it has grown. This entire online segment has grown a lot, and now VSAT is not really being used here. But still, for the remote areas where you do not have any internet connectivity or any data connectivity, VSAT can become a very, very important source. Now coming to the last article that we have today, this is INS Kolkata assists vessels hit in Gulf of Aden, rescues 21 crew members. Now overall, when it comes to this article talks about INS Kolkata. Now this INS Kolkata basically is the lead ship of the Kolkata class destroyer of the Indian Navy, and this is something that was built as a part of India's ISA program, and INS Kolkata especially was designed for variety of different tasks, for example anti-air, anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare, and at the same time having various aspects of it. Now this is when it comes to INS Kolkata. INS Kolkata was commissioned back in 2014. Alright, it was commissioned back in 2014, and this was basically to enhance India's maritime capacity and the firepower that we have. And overall, when we look at this system, this is kind of a stealth design system to reduce the radar cross section altogether, and it is something which is also equipped with a lot of weapons and sensors, including surface to surface missiles, surface to air missiles and anti-submarine rockets, and a lot of electronic warfare systems as well. So overall, INS Kolkata has been very, very crucial. Then at the same time, we see that even BrahMos subsonic cruise missiles also have been deployed on INS Kolkata, and that is also something that gives us capacity against the surface targets. And also if you have heard of the Barak 8 missiles, so BrahMos missiles also and the Barak 8 missiles that we had bought from Israel, this also for air defense has been deployed on INS Kolkata. So that's why we see that there are all these aspects which makes it one of the most advanced systems with the Navy that we have in India. So that's why it will be able to help in all these cases, and INS Kolkata basically was involved in this incident. Now lastly, looking at the mains questions for today. The first question: human wildlife conflicts are increasingly becoming critical challenge for conservation efforts and human safety, especially in areas where expanding human habitats intersect with wildlife territories. In the context of escalating conflicts between human and wildlife, critically examine the underlying causes of this conflict. So you can talk about all these issues that we have, and we talked about various ways in which we can actually help in these sectors. So you can just write about the problems in this, and towards the end you have to give a way forward. So that's why you also have to talk about solutions in these kind of questions. Second question: despite various initiatives and schemes launched by the government of India in enhancing female labor force participation in the country, it still faces significant gender gap in the labor market. Critically examine the effectiveness of the initiatives in bringing the gender gap in employment. So we have to talk about the various aspects of the problems that we are facing and what are the various solutions that the government has been working on. So we discussed about the solutions, we discussed about some of the social sector schemes and other schemes that are there in this particular market. So you basically have to talk about all that in this particular question. Right, so this brings us to the end of this session. Thank you very much for joining. There are 5 big articles, 5 editorials that we have discussed here, and they are all related to women-centric issues, because given the fact that today is International Women's Day, and that is why we saw that all these articles were given. So this is it for this session. Thank you very much for joining.